The meeting is Manufacturing Consent, Crisis Politics in the Media. We'll have Vincent, hopefully, who's a broadcaster with TV3, and Eamonn McCann, journalist and activist from Derry. So the plan is for these meetings is usually the speakers speak for about 30 minutes combined. Then we'll open up the floor to discussion and comment, and then we'll get the speakers to come back at the end. So we'll start with Eamonn. He has about 15 minutes or so. Do you want?
Vincent, about you? You all right? He was out there, you know, all the time waiting until I stood up.
I was hoping I wouldn't make it.
Right, I'll start then. Vincent, right? Yeah.
Turn it on.
Sure.
There you go.
Right, the phrase manufacturing consent comes, as far as I can recall, from Chomsky, doesn't it? Where he's talking sort of about the manipulation of information and therefore the shaping of people's minds and people's opinion in order to get them to consent to what the establishment, the ruling class, the government, whatever you want to call it, actually wants them to think. And this can be... everybody, particularly everybody, there's an awful lot of cynicism about the media, and rightly so. And particularly on the left, there's a widespread belief, maybe not just particularly on the left, sort of from politically minded people, but I experience it mainly sort of in the milieu of the left, because that's the milieu in which I move. It's people believe that there's something approaching a conspiracy sort of in the media to misrepresent what is happening and to try to corral the mass of people into believing in a particular understanding of things. I won't embarrass anybody by using names, but there was a bit of a discussion last night. None of us immune to this. I'm not talking about other lefties. You know, actually about the case of the Indian woman in Galway that there was a march about yesterday, and all that. And somebody had written a piece about it. Grady Horgan, my partner, actually had written a piece for The Guardian, and they'd asked her to write 800 words about it, which she did. And when The Guardian came out, we bought it anxiously, opened it up to see where it was. It was only about 250 words long. You know, it was a bit of a disappointment if you put a bit of an effort into writing 800 words, and also you think, well, I didn't get my point across, and all that. And somebody piped up and said that would have been deliberate, or words to that effect. What do you mean that would have been? You only wanted 250 words. They only told you they wanted 800. And why would that have been? Oh, it's so they could control the content. They could cut it down and take out whatever 250 words they made. The point is that this wasn't said by some wild person. This isn't some, like, you know, crazy guy in the corner of a pub who sees conspiracies everywhere. So serious adult person genuinely believed this. Sort of somebody, you know, be in a position to understand things a bit better. I said, but how do you think that worked? When asked, well, how do you think that worked? Do you think that they sat around like at at least, you know, the question which arises is, did they all sit around in a news conference and say, tell you what we'll do? We'll get somebody to write 800 words about that business, the abortion and the Indian woman, sort of, and then we cut it down and we can make her say, sort of whatever we want to make her say. Bollocks! Bollocks! Of course that doesn't happen. It's mad. I mean, even to recite this story sort of tells you, how can anybody believe that? Loads of people think like that. Loads of people think like that. I have more columns than the Acropolis, you know, sort of. I have had over recent years. Largely because I can't get a proper gig. I mean, at the various times I just got to get a gig. But I've got a lot of opinions, you know, so I flogged myself on that basis. So I got them in Hot Press and the Derry Journal and the Belfast Telegraph, and over the years, sort of in other places. And people are always asking me, what would you write if you were allowed? You know, well, that's what I'm allowed to write, you know. Now, mind you, of course, I mean, you are a bit, you take cognizance, you have to have a common sense approach. You know, you don't libel people, you know, sort of, because that's not going to be printed. So you don't, generally speaking, very few journalists write something that they know is not going to be printed. Why would you do that? You know, so there are parameters there, sort of, at all times, sort of, and there are difficulties in particular pieces. Tell you a story about my former partner, the late Mary Holland. He was once investigating, and this sums up an awful lot about the way that it works, because it doesn't work with owners telling editors to tell journalists to write in a particular way. That may happen, I mean, sort of, you see some of the direct connections from Murdoch's sort of more belligerent outbursts to journalists, and you read the book called Gotcha about the Sun, sort of tells an awful lot about that, and Nick Davies' Flat Earth News about the media. You can get particular examples of that, but it's not the way it usually works, and it couldn't work because journalists are not sort of all craven people who are just going to be told what to do. They do have some sort of self-respect and professional standards and all the rest of it. Strangely enough, that's true. Sort of overwhelming majority of journalists are honest sort of people. Remember, Mary was doing this story. It was about Castlereagh, the holding centre in Belfast, where a number of people were coming out, sort of overwhelmingly Republicans, a few loyalists, but mainly people who were or were suspected of being the Republican paramilitaries. And a whole series of stories were coming out where people saying they were being beaten up, that they were subjected to all forms of degrading treatment, that confessions were being extracted from them by torture and the threat of torture and threats to their families and all the rest of it, either to incriminate themselves or to incriminate other people that the cops and the authorities want to put out of the way. But it's very, very difficult to get that into print. Really, really difficult. Because at one point, I remember Mary coming in sort of one day sort of looking sort of rather aghast, and they had a conference in the Observer to consider sort of the evidence, and she has 3 or 4 statements sort of made sort of by people who alleged that this was happening. She says, and there's one editorial executive sort of looked at it all and said to her, are any of these people known to the police? What? Well, they were all very well known to the police. You know, the police wanted to know more, but the idea was, if any of them had, you know, ever been questioned about a crime or anything, it would make them unreliable people, sort of in a libel case, if that ensued. Now, the point to make a bit before I get to the end of that little story is that at the same time, I remember, exactly at the same time, there was a story from Andersonstown, which alleged that the members of the Provisional IRA were actually involved in intimidation through running black taxis and putting other people off the road, and various other scams, including a scam sort of at a local charity and so on. Some of this turned out to be true, most of it wasn't. The point was, I don't actually think that anybody would have had a problem getting that story into the paper where it finally appeared. Because if you go back sort of to the news desk, which is in Manchester, sort of at that time, nobody's going to look at that. The story about the IRA, Provisional IRA, who were not sort of the heroes of the peace process that they are now. They're all above criticism now, aren't they? In fact, I mean, you can't be a hero of peace unless you can prove that you tried to kill somebody. Now, sort of in the north, the way that it works, but that's just the way things that's actually true. I spoke to a meeting at a Europa Hotel some time ago in Belfast, sort of, which, I mean, meetings about reconciliation. Now, in the peace process industry, they are the most sectarian occasions in the whole of our. There's never been anything as sectarian as a peace process meeting about ending sectarianism. Never. Because those are the meetings where everybody has to identify themselves, you know. I come from a Catholic, nationalist, Republican background. I still hold to this, and I want to live in peace. And so I actually saw 2 people doing this. I got Spike Murray and Billy Hutchinson, Provisional IRA and the UVF, respectively, sharing a microphone. It was so close. Sharing a microphone, bit of banter back and forth. We got all that stuff. Oh, I can tell you, 10 years ago, I would have wanted to blow this man's head off, you know. And now look at us now. And we're going to live in the peace, but I haven't changed at all. I haven't changed at all. Widespread applause from an audience of about 300, about half of whom were visiting academics. I tell you, this is absolutely true. Afterwards, I made my pitch, sort of like working class unity and all that boring stuff, and all that there. And it was a lady said to me, well, the format of the meeting was we all sat down afterwards, about 8 around a table with all this little modern day sort of hug hand, all that shit, you know, sort of, and everybody said, you must be very disappointed because you can't take part in the peace process. So what are you talking about? And actually what she meant was because I'd never been at war, I couldn't now be trusted to talk about peace. Only people designated as Catholics and Protestants. That's the point that I'm making. So you can't... actually, I'll relate this to the subject in a second. A way of doing that has just occurred to me. No, I've got a good friend, a neighbour in Nittavilla, sort of in Derry. Sorry?
Another lie.
And he knows what, you know, there's no about a single identity work. Do people understand what single identity work is? No, you don't. You see, you get 2 identities in the north. You're aware of that. And everybody's supposed to be a member of one or other of the identities. If you're not a member of one of these other identities, you don't count. you know, sort of, and you can't get less power in elections and all the rest of it. Anybody wants to explain that later, I will. Sort of, you either have to be green or orange. There was a meeting sort of one of these reconciliation crowds that are always holding seminars for community representatives and so forth. And the point was being made that everybody should try to understand the Orange Order better. A lot of confusion about the Orange Order, ignorance about it, demonisation of the Orange Order, sort of, and you had to respect them because they represented the culture of one of the communities. So you had to try to understand that and grasp it. And the leader spoke up and said, there's no way I'm trying to understand that culture. I regard them as bigots. Sort of they're marching up and down, full of fear, look at them in history and all the rest of it. And she was told that's a very sectarian view. Sort of you're insulting your Protestant. She says, oh, wait a minute, I'm not insulting Protestant people. I am a Protestant. I am a Protestant. And I'm not having that Orange Order stuff. This is absolutely true. She was taken aside afterwards and told that she should go on a course of single identity work. That is where you don't have to consider the other identity and get to understand them in a more deep way. You have to understand your own identity. Your own identity, you're Protestant, you're Orange. And you know, there, I mean, there's a wonderful song by Harry Chapin Jr. that the younger people among you would not remember. It's about a little boy in an art class and the teacher's teaching him. And the chorus of it goes, says, flowers are red, my son, green grass is green. There's no need to see colours any other way than the way they always have been seen. The song goes on, but the little boy said he's a bit crazy and it becomes an art. The same with the art, nobody has to take it. That is the consensus view. That is the consensus view of everybody. Every newspaper in this country, north or south, will tell you that there's Catholics and Protestants in the north. We can disagree about why they're fighting with one another, but they are fighting with one another, have been, terrible tragedy, 3,400 dead or whatever it is. Now we've got reconciliation, the Catholics and the Protestants, the green and the orange, you're going to have to live alongside one another. That's the nature of the peace process. So you have to develop that. If you disrupt that, you're really against the peace and so forth. It's not true. This is not true. In every life and time survey in the north, in common sense, in my experience of talking to people on the street, and anecdotes are everywhere, at least a third of the people in the north do not regard themselves as orange or green, Catholic or Protestant in politics. They do not regard themselves as Irish nationalist or British unionist. They do not. They do not. It's about a third, a third, a third. That has been a consistent finding for the last 15 years. That actually explains the peace process better than anything else. How many of you ever read about that? How many of you read about that? People say, oh, look the way people vote. There's reasons for the way people vote. There's a consensus manufactured behind that. You know, people who vote orange or green are privileged in the north. Now, here's an aspect of the Belfast Agreement you don't know anything about. Many people here have read that Belfast Agreement. I sometimes say, oh, there's two over there. I'm absolutely amazed because you've read it as well. Because for a long while there, I was convinced that I was the only person who had ever read it. You know, it's only 11,000 words long, very badly written, very, very badly written document. That's one of the reasons hardly anybody not one, Vincent might have found one that I missed, not one good phrase in it, not one ringing phrase, nothing that will echo down through the years. You know, documents like this are supposed to be full of things like, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You know, things like that, Irish man and Irish woman and then blah, blah, blah. Ringing phrases, that's when you get the great declarations. That's because those documents knew what they were talking about and had confidence in it. You know, and when people have certainty of what they're saying and understand or believe that it's noble and so forth, that you can produce phrases like that. When your document is shifty, when it's dishonest, when sort of it is trying to wheedle this way into people's consciousness that it doesn't represent what it claims to represent, then you're not going to get a finely written document. There's nothing in it. But what was the point I was making? Oh yes, wait. If you look at the Strand 1 section of it, nobody ever does apart from me. I read it all the time. In fact, frequently, I'm sitting there and I ask myself, am I going to watch matches a day? I am going to watch matches of the day, but I see a copy of the Belfast Agreement on the back of the case. And it's been weeks since I've read it. I just can't stop myself. I go over and get it. And I read this bit. Is that getting through? It's Strand 1, paragraph 5. Look it up. Get it and Google that and it'll come straight up. And it talks about going into Stormont, what you have to do. If you're elected into Stormont, the first day you're there, you have to register yourself and designate yourself. You designate yourself Catholic nationalist, Protestant nationalist, unionist, or other. Seems fair enough, doesn't it? You go in there, sort of, and the other Alliance parties, other, and Governor Ball, Stephen Agnew, the Green Party, other, and so forth. The then follows the rules of how Stormont is to operate, and how you actually make decisions, and how you pass them. That reference to designating yourself as orange, green, or other is the only reference to other. Immediately after that, come through it if you like. You did. Others just disappear. They don't count anymore. So when it comes to actually deciding things in Stormont, if you're not orange or green, you're disadvantaged. For example, what you could do sort of is a thing known as, I'll be finished now, there's a thing that any 30 members of either designation, not 15 of each is no good. If you can get 30 people who have been designated nationalists, or 30 people who have been designated unionists, in effect you can have a veto over anything that happens to Stormont, which is why the DUP wields such power sort of on social and moral issues and all that. What it means is sort of if you get 30 people who put down a petition of concern, what that says is, and it has to be accepted, that in order for this measure to pass, a majority, in simple terms, a majority of each side must support it. So if you've got a majority on your side, on one side, you can stop it. In other words, all you have to have, and this is the system of government we've got in the North, you have to have 50% plus one of the nationalists, or 50% plus one of the unionists, and that can stop anything. I.e., the DUP on its own can stop anything. It's got an absolute veto in the North. Sinn Féin only needs one more. They've got 29 MLAs at the minute in order to have it. There you have. So the whole system pre-programmed for sectarian deadlock. That's when people say it's not working very well that way. Can't they handle this and that? That's the main reason. Now the point that I'm asking you about is this, and I'll finish on this. How many people have heard the Belfast Agreement, or Good Friday Agreement? We've got separate names for everything. I never call it the Good Friday Agreement. It gives it a sort of religious, we get revere it or something. It's actually called the Multi-Party Agreement, if you want the real name for it. That's what it calls itself. You understand? But how many people have heard that aspect of it described? How many people have heard a discussion of whether the sectarian basis of the agreement provides sort of a basis for long-term peace, or whether it can possibly provide a basis for the long-term elimination of sectarian hostility? And many people hear the argument going on as to whether, in fact, it reinforces sectarianism, sort of ensures that the best future that we can hope for is one not in which people come to live together, but in which they live separately, but not actually gutting one another every Friday night. Where's that argument about? Where's that argument when we see the Orange Order parading up and down outside Catholic churches and people getting upset about it and all that? It's not there, because consent has been manufactured. This is the point. And for the Belfast Agreement, not because journalists have been told to lie about it, but because it is the common sense sort of all things. You know, that's just the way things are in the North. That's the way it is automatically sort of been understood and reported and analysed and so forth. And it is a lie. It's a lie. What you'll be told about everything you'll be told about the agreement sort of is a lie. I've got a number of other examples to do, sort of with the miners' strike, with Hillsborough, with various other things. Each will take 10 minutes, and I will come back to those.
About 50 minutes. Why can't I have a half an hour like you?
You're only 16.
I think I'm in the wrong place. I came here to talk about the media.
You better use the mic.
Okay, bye. I won't be able to. This is going to cause me problems. I'm going to deal with the issue of the common sense thing and how the media is the instrument whereby common sense is created. I'll go to that. Basically, ideology, ideology is created or engendered by three institutions, primarily the religion, by education and the media. But I think the media probably is more influential now in that regard than either of the other two. And essentially it's involved in the creation of what Eamonn was calling the common sense. That is a widely shared belief that feels spontaneous and feels obvious, and it purports to reflect certain unassailable truths and unchangeable truths about the way things are. And it is these qualities that give common sense great political power, ideas that work to promote the interests, and inevitably they work to promote the interests of the majority against the interests of the minority, rather, against the interests of the majority, and do so, and thereby creating a consensus view which is not derived through coercion, but derived through the consent of people who consent to ideas and consent to policies that are essentially against their own interests. And I think that's the huge driving force of inequality, the huge driving force of injustice in society. Let me give you a few ideas of common sense ideas that are perpetrated nowadays. And please, when I use the word common sense, I mean it in this ideological sense of creating a shared understanding of the way things are. One of them is, and it's maybe the most insidious of them, is at present, is that this country is broke. You hear it again and again and again, the country is broke. Another is that we simply can't afford universal health care, continuance of lavish social welfare benefits, free education, etc. That we're already taxed to the hilt and the taxpayer cannot take any more. That income tax is a tax on jobs. That we're all in this together, the pain must be shared by all across society. That we live in democracy and the people voted for the parties that are present implementing these painful policies, but we in effect endorsed those in the last election. And that the bank debt of 64 billion is a crippling budget, and this underlines the extent to which the country is broke. Now, I want to challenge each of those ideas, and I suspect that even in a gathering such as this, many people believe some of these things, that, for instance, about the bank debt or about the country being broke or whatever. The first is that the country isn't broke. Ireland is the 16th richest country in the world. Yeah, the state is broke, but that's because we don't fund the state properly. Second is that we can afford universal health care, we can afford more social welfare, better social welfare, we can afford better health, because we're a rich country. The national income is about 128 billion per year, and that's what it's estimated to be this year, after all the years of austerity. And this works out at about 29,000 per man, woman and child in the society, or about 106,000 per household. Now, I think that and households, even after they pay tax or whatever, are pretty well off if it's 106,000. In fact, very well off compared to people around the world. It is huge riches. We are a very, very wealthy society. The stuff about being taxed to the hilt and all that stuff, well, we're not taxed to the hilt by comparison with other European countries, but I want to challenge the notion about taxation in a little bit. The stuff about income, that the income tax is a tax on jobs, another piece of insidiousness, as is that the pain must be distributed, and that, but also the idea of jobs. I think that the perception of jobs, I think, is something that we ought to question as well. And finally, the idea of democracy, that we all live in a democracy. Only in the shallowest sense do we live in a democracy, and the idea of the people being self-governing is just not true. And before I want to go on to deal with the state, taxation, jobs and democracy, I want to take another example of how a common sense is seemingly created in an innocuous way, but in a way that is hugely ideological resources and has huge power, I think, and it is the use of the word taxpayer. The word taxpayer, I think, instinctively conveys an income taxpayer, and the hard-pressed income taxpayer can't take any more. And it's their money, my money, and it's always hard-earned. My hard-earned money taken out of my pocket to fund to fund freeloaders, fund social welfare fraud, to fund massive government waste and all that. I've had enough. You're not going to get any more of my money. And that I think is, this was brilliantly used by Ronald Reagan in the Reagan Revolution in the United States. Not that other people didn't use it prior to them, but it was used most effectively by Ronald Reagan, in order to create an environment and an attitude that the state is something alien, something oppressive, something that we should be suspicious about, and we should do our part, do everything in our power to weaken it. This whole idea, by the way, of the state, I think, is another thing. There is an idea that the state is something apart from society, that it's something different, it's out there somewhere, and we've got to control it or got to do things with it, rather than seeing state as the agency of society whereby we cooperate together in society. That's what the state is, and it should be entirely under the control of the people in a way that I'll just deal with in a moment. But going back to the idea of the taxpayer, the idea that it's my money taken out of my pocket, my hard-earned money to fund all these things. We've got to challenge the idea that it's my money. It isn't. All wealth and all income is created by society. You cannot create wealth outside society. And it's all created through social cooperation. Can't be done otherwise. And therefore, I would argue that all wealth and income is owned by society as a whole, and that it's up to society to determine how that wealth and income should be distributed. And if you look at it from that perspective, and look at the state as the agency whereby we cooperate together, I think you'd have a different attitude. And you wouldn't think that the state is broke, or that we are broke, the country is broke, or whatever. The country isn't broke. The country is very wealthy. Even if you take into account the horrendous 64 billion bank debt, or whatever it's going to emerge up to be, we're still hugely wealthy and hugely well off as compared with the rest of the country somewhat. Let me give you an idea of about society and how wealth creation and that. Two of the most wealthiest people in this society at the moment are Maya Doherty and John McColgan, the people who are involved in river dance. And just think about the river dance phenomenon. It was hugely successful, and you may remember the Eurovision Song Contest, where it was a great triumph in the interval of the Eurovision Song Contest, whatever, sometime in the 1990s. And how it went on to become one of the great entrepreneurial successes, made huge amounts of money, primarily for Maya Doherty and John McColgan, and became a big thing in China and America and all that sort of stuff. But how did this thing come about in the first place? This came about because of the tradition of Irish dancing in this society as a whole. It came about because of Irish dance teachers teaching young people to dance, about parents bringing their children to dancing schools, about parents funding their children to go to dancing schools. It comes about through that whole culture of dancing that happened in society. And suddenly this was appropriated by these ingenious entrepreneurs who suddenly took all this over and made it their business, their money. It was their money, the income derived from this phenomenon, which was entirely socially created. Except for the glass that was put in it, the packaging that was put in it by Maya Doherty, and brilliantly put in it by Maya Doherty and John McColgan. They merely created the packaging. All the rest was created by society, by hundreds, by thousands of people over generations and over generations over generations here. And yet it became their money, their and hard-earned money, and in their pockets, and they resent giving their money up to fund freeloaders, social welfare fraud, massive government wastage and all that. So the point I'm really hoping to convey through this example of wealth being socially created, I think that the river dance idea is fairly illustrative, and most of us can buy into the idea that this was a social creation. But so too is everything else. It's all socially created. It's our money. Not my money or your money, it's our money. And therefore we have, us in society, we as a society, we as citizens in this state, have a right to determine how our money is going to be distributed. And once you get that into your head, I think you change your attitude to, you don't talk about our state being broke, because it isn't broke, or our society being broke, it isn't broke. We're very rich. So long as we continue to agree. Oh, 5 minutes. It took he was talking for 20 minutes before he got to 5 minutes. Then he talked for another 20 minutes. Jesus. I think that the reason we have a screwed up society is largely because of the ideas that are screwed up in so many heads. All the ideas that country is broke, that's our money and all that sort of stuff. And in order to make any progress or get anywhere with regard to all this, we've got to challenge this common sense thing. For if we fail to challenge the common sense, we can't make progress without some kind of push or something, which I think is very dangerous. And the common sense, and we ought to challenge the common sense at every level. Object to the use of the word taxpayer. Object to the use of the continued repetition that we're broke, that we can't afford anything, or whatever. See society as society has owning all the wealth and income, and society having the right to distribute all the wealth and income. And I would argue that we should distribute all the wealth and income equally. And the reason for that is that we cannot create equality throughout other areas of society without equal distribution of wealth and income. We can't have equality in healthcare, for instance. We can't have equality in education. We can't have equality of opportunity. The idea that we can create equality of opportunity in the society that we have now is just crazy. Another one of the common sense nonsense, another of the common sense nonsense that is perpetrated generally in society. But I have a sense that the left doesn't engage in this counter-hegemony idea, doesn't enough challenge the common sense notions that are in society here, and doesn't see that that is its primary function, and to do it in language and in terms that people can understand and relate to and are not alienated by. You have to take account of existing culture and take account of those language and tone that alienate people, and I think that's hugely important. But principally, what the media has managed to create an idea that the concern of the masses, the primary concern of the masses, is the contentedness of the privileged and the elite. Because if the elite are not content and are not happy with this, they will fail to allow their wealth to be trickled down. They will fail to, the tall poppies will fail to create the jobs for the rest of us, and that we will all be disadvantaged if the elite isn't contented. Just finally about the jobs. The idea that jobs is where it's at is, in my view, insidious. It's roles. What people do in society and how they contribute to society is what it is. Jobs are the locus of subjugation, the locus of exploitation so much. Not just exploitation in terms of wages, but exploitation in terms of power, exploitation in terms of respect, exploitation in terms of some people controlling the lives of other people in the way that happens to our society. Anyway, going back to the idea of the media and the consent, that unless we challenge the common sense that has permeated the minds of people in society, we won't make any progress, and I've suggested ways in which that might happen.
I do believe myself, it might be an eccentric point of view, I do believe that the general coverage of the North is the single greatest crime against accurate and incisive reporting. Even more so than any of the other things that have been mentioned, and I think there's reasons for that. But that's why. But the question when I mentioned that the idea that the northern problem consists only of, and that the solution consists only of a rebalancing of the orange population and the green population. I mean, that is so much part of common sense that sometimes when you argue otherwise and say, look, that's not really what this agreement is about, that's not really what's happening, I find the people who would be political and even on the left and intelligent people, that ask me, do you really mean that? Do you really believe that? What do you mean? They're just bewildered by the suggestion that this should be shown. And even some people in this room, it's a bit idealistic really to think that that's it. Of course it's about orange and green and so forth. Well, no, it is not about orange and green, but a whole lot of other things about power relationships. It's the ways in which an ideology which is about a vertical division in society prevents ideas coming into the political discourse which are about the horizontal division in society. And at some level this is deliberate. At some level that's deliberate. I don't mean the people who are writing it and so forth are saying we're going to have another one of these articles in order to reinforce something. But it brings us to the question, I think this might clarify a wee bit to the extent to which whether I'm being realistic or I'm not. But somebody said that, well, it's about struggle in the end. You see, ask yourself, where can you find a crowd? In the North, for example, could you get 30,000 people, half of them Catholics and half of them Protestants together, and say to them, all at the one time, the difference between Catholics and Protestants is not what's going on here. What's happening here is that the rich are exploiting the poor, that capitalism is exploiting the working class, that the common sense thing for us to do is to get together on a basis which has got nothing to do with the community that we come from? Is it possible to do that, do you think? 15,000 on each side, standing in front of Belfast City Hall, talking like that to them, and them applauding and saying that's true? That's the truth. That's the real way. Well, it is possible because I've done it. The trade union movement has done it. I stood in front of them and said that. I've spoken on the Shankill Road about that, and places and to audiences that I would have felt very frightened to face, sort of at many times, when it's on social and economic things, about a post office strike. I remember walking in the front of a trade union demonstration, unofficial trade union demonstration, a couple of years back, up the Shankill Road. And 3 times, from the bottom of the Shankill Road, up till we got to, I forget what you call it, sort of the peace line, sort of which we then marched through, and back down the falls. And on 3 occasions, people come walking onto the road at the front of the march with post delivery people. And on 3 occasions, people walked onto the road, shook my hand, and they all said exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. We thought, you're very welcome on the Shankill Road, Mr. McCann. All call me Mr. McCann, for some reason. Now ask yourself this, in what other context would that have happened if it was not by what Marx has called the class struggle? In what other context where people would be saying to me, you're very welcome on the Shankill Road? Only when that was the main thing in people's minds. That was the strike which began on the Shankill and spread to the falls. I won't go into the detail of it. Or when you're standing talking about austerity. Now these things are brief, they're transient. And then you can say, well, people go back into their camps. Yes, they do. Because those ideas and those issues are not foregrounded. They're not the one. Give you another example of the way in which struggle can change ideas. Struggle and mass struggle can make things which seem crazy and obscure into the immediate common sense. Yesterday when we were marching along, did you notice I think most of the people here were on that march? The number of times people were chanting about a woman's right to choose, abortion rights now, and so forth. Now, it's not so long ago I can remember. My partner, Grady Horgan, was the original sort of national organiser of the anti-amendment campaign, way back 30 years ago. You know, you wouldn't believe that, you look at it, but anyway. It's, at those days, people said, don't mention abortion. Don't mention the right to choose. This is about an amendment, sort of, which goes against democracy, and it would be backward and all the rest of it. Hardly anybody. In fact, people who wanted to argue at that time for a woman's right to choose were not allowed on the platforms. They were kept off in a quite undemocratic way by people who regarded themselves as on the left. Now, so you couldn't do it. Now, if you had said, sort of before the last couple of weeks, if you had said, we're going to march through Dublin, we're going to stand on platforms, and somebody, Claire Daly, is going to say, and we believe in a woman's right to choose abortion. Yeah, they're right, and get a big response. People would say, you can't do it, don't mention abortion. But when people were there in those numbers, and had a sense of their own power, had a sense of the fact that this is not a crazy sort of individual thing that I believe in, there's strength around it, then it became okay to say it. Now, actually, of course, that mightn't last either. There's going to be now sort of a ridiculous debate, sort of, and I actually believe that the Fine and Labour are going to produce sort of a formula, sort of which will enable all sorts of people to say, yes, we'll have that procedure, but it's not really abortion, double effect and all that and shit. Sort of when other people say this proves that this thing can't happen again. But nevertheless, sort of, I'm saying that that thing fades away. It is possible to argue to masses of people for a woman's right to choose abortion, full stop, and that it's not simply about vulnerable. There's some patronising tone to an awful lot of this commentary in the last few days. It seemed to be, but poor woman, suffering woman, you know, sort of vulnerable woman. All that's true, of course, but it's not the key point. It's not the key point. The point is about a woman's right to choose. That you can say it. You can say it. And that is true sort of all sorts of other issues. Sort of that we're on about. If you go back to the north, and so when I saw people think about sectarianism in the north, I sometimes think there's nothing wrong with the north of Ireland. You know, sort of a good general strike wouldn't put right. You know, sort of they didn't have people. Yeah, I'm serious about it. That's what it's going to take. And it's not meant to say, you know, that's grand, but I mean, it's not meant. What I'm saying is sort of that the conditions under which this sort of common sense notion about the north, the conditions under which it'll change, it's not because I or anybody else has argued for or sold pamphlets saying there's other ways of looking at these things. As when people have experience of actual struggle, and incidentally, that is one of the reasons that none of the community-based, the communal-based parties in the north have got any stomach for this type of struggle, because they know it undermines the basis of their support which is about trying to which party can be the best champion for one or other particular communities. So look, I just needed to that because I've been now told twice to shut up, and if I'm going any longer, I'll never hear the end of Vincent Browne. So I should have. But I'll just say to this that every time you hear something, another thing, very, very final thing I would say, as I sit down, so it's just that the person who talked about sort of organisation of journalists and union organisation is absolutely right. So the big thing that was missing in all those discussions about News International and the rest of it, where was the collective voice of journalism? Where was somebody standing and saying, well, I represent the journalists at News International, and I can tell you blah, 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 blah. Nobody could do that because union organisations have been destroyed in it. There's a direct connection between struggle to organise journalists as workers on the one hand and the freedom of the media to tell lies on the other. Those two things, in other words, the best thing what we can do about Levison's going to come out, and I disagree with whoever was saying about the need to monitor journalists and all the rest of it. We're not having that, Pippi. You better believe it, that is not going to happen. And the bloody Tory MPs talking about licensing journalists. Or that's not going to happen, and we'll fight it all the way. But what there is need for is the unionisation of newsrooms so that journalists can stand up for journalism. Thanks very much.
I'm not going to ask for equality of time.
You got 7.
Just to deal with some of the points that were raised, of course taxation has to be the instrument by which you distribute income and wealth in society. That's no way out of it. Secondly, with regard to conflicts of interest, people appearing on television and radio programmes, you're absolutely dead right. And we haven't been rigorous enough in getting people to declare their conflicts of interest. Actually, I did raise that point, Constantine could give. But in general, the point you're making is absolutely valid. On the question of the left and where does the money come from when they say, why doesn't somebody from the left make the point that we're a very rich society? As a society, we can afford all these things. And nobody bothers making that bloody point. Instead, they continue arguments about wealth tax and stuff about income tax and all that. Just simply say, it's our bloody money, we decide how we're going to distribute it. Why don't we argue that? And then when challenged about what do you mean it's our money, what about my money, to make the point, explain why it's our money. And if the left engage in those kind of responses and those kind of ideas, I think it would be better. With regard to journalists being impartial and that, yeah, you're dead right. Whoever made the point is absolutely dead right. There's no such thing as impartiality. That we all come to issues from particular political or other ideological perspectives. And that even where it appears there's impartiality, for instance, the questions you choose to ask, it reflects, and choose not to ask, reflects a particular point of view. And there's no way of getting out of that. Also, the issues that you you choose to explore reflect priorities that you have, and that is determined by your ideology and by your politics. There's no way of getting out of that. But I think that it would be better if there was an appreciation, if the public appreciated that we are not impartial, that we ask questions from particular perspectives. We do choose to talk about or write about matters from the issues we choose to write about or talk about come from a political perspective. And it would be better if there was that understanding that there's no such thing as impartiality. We're all partial, determined by what it is that we think, and often by our conflicts of interest. I was shocked to see in one of the newspapers this morning that a judge had shareholding in CRH, and that his shareholding increased in CRH during the time when he was adjudicating on a case concerning CRH, Smith Wilson. I happen to know the judge, John Cook, was the UCD with him, and I like the guy, and I think he's the principal fellow. But I would have thought that judges should have no shareholding in anything. There just should be no conflict. And incidentally, I think that about journalists too. There should be no shareholding, none of that stuff at all. And that insofar as we've interest, declare them, and it shouldn't be privately declared. It should be publicly declared on websites. And I absolutely agree with that. With regard to the media generally, just the crucial thing about the media is that us in the media are delivering audiences to advertisers. Whether in the print media or in the electronic media, we're delivering audiences to advertisers. Like the Irish Times survives, insofar as it does, in delivering an ABC1, an upper income bracket audience to the advertisers who advertise in it. And if it doesn't, it won't work. Similarly, TV3 delivers a more mass audience to advertisers, which is helpful from my perspective actually, but that's the point of it. RTE delivers a slightly different audience to advertisers. And that is hugely determining of what TV3 or RTE or Irish Times or Independent or whatever, what the content, the tone, and again the choice of subjects. And that is hugely influential and determining factor. Finally, with regard to Israel, I think that we should just the discussion in Israel should start with challenging the right of the state of Israel to exist. Now, I am not of the view that pragmatically you can end the state of Israel, but if you start, as you're often invited and are almost required to do, by saying, do you accept the right of the state of Israel to exist? You're then trapped. We should reflect back on, well, how did this thing come about? It came about because land was stolen from the native Arab population and they were driven out of it. And there's no way of getting out of that. You can argue the pros and cons of who started the most recent conflict or whatever, and you'll win some and lose some on that, and the clever debaters on the other side will lose on occasions. But if you start from the thing, well, there is a fundamental injustice with regard to the state of Israel, and that has got to be addressed. And what do you expect with conflict arising from a situation like that? And unless you start from that premise, you're never going to deal with the issue of state of Israel. And I know people are arguing now that challenging the right of the state of Israel to exist is itself anti-Semitic. And there is this blackmail thing that you express any criticism, let alone question the right of the state of Israel to exist, the anti-Semitic charges brought against you, which I think is grossly unfair. I think most of us here would regard what happened to the Jews down through the centuries, in particular the Holocaust, was an utter abomination, and the Holocaust itself was probably the greatest crime against humanity in the history of humankind. But to have the anti-Semitism tag attached to anybody who's critical of the state of Israel or sceptical of the right of the state of Israel to exist, that's it. Anyway, thank you very much.